It's episode 87 of the Author Stories podcast. I'm your host, Hank Garner. Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/Hank. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Today's podcast is also brought to you by Gamefly.com. Sign up for a premium free 30-day trial specifically for my listeners at www.gameflyoffer.com/Hank. Be sure to use the www before that and /Hank. You can find all of the archives of the show, as always, at hankgarner.com. And if you don't mind, while you're there, click on the button and subscribe to the podcast. It'll just let you know when new episodes are out. You don't have to download them all, but be sure you subscribe. Also, if you don't mind, rate the podcast at iTunes or wherever you download the show. It helps other folks find us and make sure that everyone is getting these great interviews that I bring you each and every week. Thanks for listening. On to my interview with Dan Wells. Thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today I'm very excited to have a return guest on the show. Dan Wells was here on episode number 10 of the Author Stories podcast, and when this one airs, it's going to be about episode 85, I think. Dan is the co-host, I can't get my words straight, of the Writing Excuses podcast. He is also a writing teacher and a fantastic novelist. Welcome back to the show, Dan.
Well, thank you for having me. I am glad to be back.
Excellent. So you have a brand new book coming out in a couple of weeks, probably about a week from when this airs. You got started writing horror with the John Cleaver series, and then you had a fantastic YA series that you put out, and this one seems to be a little different from both of those. Blue Screen is your new novel. Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, Blue Screen is probably closer to partials than it is to the John Cleaver books, but it is the first book in a new teen cyberpunk series. It's a genre that I've always loved, and a couple years ago I thought, hey, I think it's time for cyberpunk to come back. So I started working on one, and in the meantime, a whole bunch of cyberpunk things have come out. So apparently we're all on the same page with this. So, hooray! One of the best genres is returning to science fiction. Anyway.
Yeah, so, I'm excited to read it. It looks fantastic. The early reviews are great. Tell us a little bit about the genesis of the story.
Ooh, that's a tricky question. What I wanted to do with this one, I don't know, I'm trying to figure out the best way to frame this for you. Honestly, from my perspective as an author, I sat down and I knew that I wanted to tell a cyberpunk story. And I kind of had a general feeling of, the way I wanted the world to work and so on. So when I was trying to structure it, to figure out how I would make this work as a series, the idea that I kept coming back to was that it would not be serialized. And I kind of refer to this as the X-Files model.
Okay.
In the sense that, the old X-Files show, most of the episodes stood by themselves, the Monster of the Week episodes.
Okay. But
every now and then you'd get what they called a myth arc episode. And if you were a fan of the show, those, would give you this very long form thing where they would go through and you'd learn another piece of the alien conspiracy, and you'd learn about Mulder's sister, and you'd learn about alien abductions and all of this. And if you were not a hardcore fan of the show, you could pretty much still pick up any episode and be entertained by it. And it always bothers me to be at a signing somewhere or at a convention and have someone come up to me and say, "Hey, I've never read your books. Is this a good one to start?" And then I have to say, "Well, actually, this is book 3 of a series, so you probably need to get the first one first, and this bookstore doesn't have that in stock because we sold out this morning." And so I wanted to do, books that you could read in any order. And I guess you could almost, F. Paul Wilson did this to some extent with the Repairman Jack books. You can pick those up and they work well on their own, even if you hadn't read the ones that come before. But if you have read the ones that come before, it expands the world a little bit for you. And there's an episodic story that will entertain the neophyte, and then there is the big serialized backstory that's still there if you're looking for it. And so that's the idea that I had with this new series. It's called Mirador, which is the neighborhood in Los Angeles where all the characters live, or some of the characters live. And so I kind of structured it that way. I designed it specifically to be an interesting world with really interesting characters about whom I could tell a bunch of stories, but not necessarily requiring a big, huge investment of mental space on the part of the reader. I don't want to get 10 books into this and lose readers every time because, well, you have to start at the beginning. You'll be able to read any of them. So it's much more of a kind of classic series character kind of series than it is a massive story that's split into a bunch of different pieces. That was a really long explanation for what ended up being a very simple concept.
No, I love that answer, and I love that you're approaching this in a non-serialized way. You have through your various outlets, you have your ear to what's going on with writers and publishing, probably more than the average writer. Do you feel like there's a certain pressure to write a big series, that has cliffhangers and that has people immediately wanting the next book as soon as you finish that? Do you feel like that's a thing for writers?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I understand. I'm sorry. Rephrase that for me.
Well, let me just put it this way. There's, when someone is starting out, one of the pieces of advice that successful writers give to new writers is write a series. Get people interested in your characters, get them interested in their arc, and get them hooked so that they keep coming back to buy more books. And so, you've got, like Harry Potter, who, of course, you read the first one and you know there's going to be 7 books in the series and you want to get through that. The way publishing is today, do you feel like there's pressure on writers to not tell a self-contained story, but to keep setting up for sequels?
Well, that's really interesting because on the one hand, you're absolutely right. And that is the really common advice that we get today is write a series.
Right.
And when I started trying to sell books 15, 16 years ago, it was completely opposite. No one would buy a series or a trilogy from a new writer. They wanted standalones. And what we've seen since is some kind of shift, and I could speculate but hesitate to do so on why that shift has happened. But, that's what the market wants now is the series idea for the reasons that you described. Because, the market wants to invest itself in characters. And then once we like these characters, then we want to read more about them. And some of that, to speculate just a little bit, is the same kind of attitude that we're seeing in movies and in TV shows, where a reboot or a remake will always get the green light ahead of original content because it's a safe bet. Here is a proven property, and so that's what people want. I don't know what to tell new writer. I mean, the obvious thing to tell someone who's trying to break into the industry is to write whatever you're really excited about, because that, more than anything else, is going to be what sells it, because that excitement is visible. And if you are writing something that you think you should be writing instead of writing something that you love, then the audience knows that you're just kind of eating your vegetables and that you're not really in love with it, and so they're not going to be in love with it either. That said, I always go back to the standby. And again, I started breaking into this industry in a very different time, which feels bonkers to say at this point. But you know, the hallmark that we would use all the time 15 years ago was standalone with series potential. Here's a story that works really well on its own. If you like it, I can expand it. And if you just want to publish this by itself and see if it works, then that's it. Really, I think that the more specific and arguably more useful advice to give is to make sure that you are telling a story with an end. Even if it is the first part of a bigger story. I mean, look at Star Wars. Look at A New Hope, which I'm old enough that that's still called just Star Wars for me. It is one part of what is now a 7-part series and growing all the time. But it has an incredibly solid ending. And you get to that ending, and you know that things have concluded, you know that things have been accomplished, you know that plot threads have been wrapped up, and you feel satisfied by it. But at the same time, it's very easy to look at it and go, oh, there's a billion more stories that can be told about these characters and this world. And that's what you want a reader and an editor and an agent and a publisher to see when they read your story. And knowing how to construct a story, first of all, instead of just saying, here's a whole bunch of stuff that happens and then the book ends. Knowing how to actually construct a story so that you get that satisfying arc and conclusion at the end, I think that is what is going to sell people on you as a writer. And then, yes, because of the way the market is today, the next book they want from you, more often than not, is going to be a continuation of what you've already written, rather than something that is completely new. But knowing how to tell a single satisfying story, I think that's the foot in the door that we're just too many authors, even published authors, are falling down on right now.
Yeah. Well, I think it's exciting that you're approaching this in the kind of enter the series anywhere you like approach. I guess it's kind of like a wheel of time. If you're trying to introduce someone to this new series and say, well, there's, all of these books, but you've got to go back to number one and start there. And I think some people, kind of get a little overwhelmed, and they're like, well, you're asking me, I mean, this is like a 2-year of my life investment, to make it through these books. Mm-hmm. So I love that, coming back to the, easy entry for readers. I think that's great. So where did you said you wanted to write cyberpunk. Were you a big fan of cyberpunk?
Yes. And I say I'm a big fan of it. I'm a carefully metered fan of it. Let's put it that way. One of my favorite authors of all time is Philip K. Dick, who you could certainly make an argument has a lot of cyberpunk elements to him. Yeah. But then on top of that, there's William Gibson, and there's Neil Stephenson, and there's all these others that have written in the genre. And cyberpunk was huge, but there was never a ton of it. I don't know exactly how to phrase this without sounding, arrogant about this, or maybe patronizing. It came out, and it was of a very specific time and place. There was let's be generous and say a 10-year period in which cyberpunk was just the rage, and people wrote it constantly. But there were only a handful of authors that were really into it,
Yeah.
And so I've been kind of measuring out my consumption of cyberpunk. And as an example, it was only last year that I finally got around to reading the Buddha Yin books. And the name of the author escapes me right now. They're very different from William Gibson, but they were fantastic, and I loved them. And I love the ideas behind cyberpunk, And one of the great things about it now, and definitely the reason that we are seeing a resurgence of it, a renaissance, a second wave of post-cyberpunk, however you want to call it, is because we've caught up to it in so many ways. One of the things that I love about the world we live in, the movie Social Network, that is at this point, 2 years old, 3 years old?
Yeah.
That movie was about millions of people interacting in a virtual online space, and it was nonfiction. Like, that's the world we live in. That's amazing to me. And that didn't even have virtual reality yet. And we're at a point now where, there is almost every day a new article about, virtual reality is the hot new tech. All of these companies are doing it. We have consumer level affordable virtual reality now, which we've never had before. We have all of the problems that cyberpunk predicted about privatized governments and corporate interests ruling the world. Those are all coming true now. We have, robotic technology and artificial intelligence technology that is all kind of hitting the point where, Stephen Hawking and Elon Musk, two of the greatest minds of our technological age, are warning us about the robot apocalypse. A few years ago, the United Nations, the United Nations, for crying out loud, released a paper that was warning specifically in those words about the dangers of a robot apocalypse. We live in a very cyberpunky world now, and it's not the future anymore. And I think authors and audiences are looking at that, and first of all, they're saying, wow, these ideas are understandable. I remember the first time I read Neuromancer, way back in like 94, and thinking, I don't even understand what this book is about. And then read it again about 10 years later and thought, oh, I understand this perfectly, because now 10 years later, all of the technology in it is at least recognizable, even if it isn't real yet. And so on the one hand, we're looking at that and we're saying, wow, these things are coming true. This technology speaks to the world that we live in. And then B, I think audiences and authors are looking at cyberpunk and saying, this concept of near future science is thrilling because we are watching it come true in our lifetimes. People who grew up reading Ender's Game, which is not cyberpunk, but which predicted internet culture and blogs and social media decades before they came true. And now we live in that world, and we have that kind of internet culture that Ender's Game predicted, and it's all real now. And we are able to look at this and go, well, I want to play with those ideas, and I want to extrapolate where I think X and Y and Z are going to be 20 or 30 or 50 years from now, because we might be right. And when you're writing about, terrifying cyberpunk dystopias where everything's grim and dark, you don't necessarily want to be right, but there's still that kind of thrilling thing where you can look at it and go, well, let's take drone technology, for example. Let's take robotics and predict where that is now, where that is likely to go, and all the horrible things that will happen to our society when that technology goes the direction we think it's going to go. And then we can actually watch it unfold. And so there's a sense of almost reality TV to it, where we are playing with the future while the future is becoming true, and we're interacting with our science fiction in a way that you can't with space opera or those kind of golden age science fiction about interstellar travel. That's still in the future for us.
Yeah. I wonder if some of the appeal of early cyberpunk was that it was so far into the distant future, it felt like, that it almost seemed like it was magic. For the garden variety reader, like some of these concepts were so far fetched and so very much like space opera. It might as well be for the average reader, and our imaginations could just kind of run wild. Whereas now, like you said, we're living in an age where these things are quickly becoming reality, and we're beginning to see ourselves immersed in ways that we never thought imaginable 10 years ago. So as a writer who is who's writing in the genre now, what is the challenge to write this sort of story and stay ahead of the curve? I know this is a pretty loaded question, but how do you approach it now that we do live, and we live in a time now where two-year-old children can pick up an iPad and can flip through and know how to pinch and zoom pictures. It seems like we as a race are just exponentially jumping toward this. How as a writer do you keep a visionary approach while watching it quickly catch up to you?
That is without question the hardest part of this, and it's getting frustrating, honestly. There's at least one big science fictional idea in Blue Screen that I have seen in the news since I finished writing it. And so I guess the first answer to your question is I haven't been keeping far ahead enough. It's hard to stay ahead of that kind of technology when you're dealing with near future and when you're trying to extrapolate, internet or communication or drones or robotics or self-driving cars or whatever it is that you're working on. And we're just advancing in all of those areas so fast. Just as one very minor example, there was a part in Blue Screen where they were talking about the size of a hard drive and how much memory it could hold. And I extrapolated, a thumb drive to the next generation of how much more could that hold. And my editor came back and said, there's no way. You have to take this one or two, orders of magnitude further than you did, because 35 years in the future, that kind of memory is going to be nothing. And so, and like I said, that's a very minor example. You take something bigger, and this is I'll say one of the two biggest challenges was predicting all the different kinds of technology at once. I think, at the risk of sounding really prideful, that it is relatively easy to pick one thing, let's say self-driving cars, and then accurately describe more or less where it's going to be 35 years in the future. It is virtually impossible. It is definitely impossible to take self-driving cars and drones and bioengineering and 3D printing and space exploration and blah, 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 all of these things, and predict where society as a whole will be in 35 years based on all of those advances. And so you just kind of have to pick your battles. What I did was focus on one or two or three things and say, okay, this is a little house of cards that I've built of, this will develop in one way, and then another technology will develop in another, and they will inform each other in such and such a manner, and that will create society that I am writing about. And then everything else, you either have to hand wave or you have to say, well, there's been big advances in it, but they haven't affected our culture yet. Or more likely, given the level of globalization that I'm assuming will continue, I'm allowing these other technologies, for example, the first book and even the second book that I just finished writing, they don't really deal with biotech at all. And so my assumption for the world is that by the time I get to a book where I want to tell a story about bioengineering, it will be a technology that is much more prevalent in another country. That, say, Brazil or India or whatever has advanced in bioengineering much more quickly than the United States has, and that's why it is a big deal, but it hasn't been a big deal yet in the series. And that's kind of the cheat that I've been keeping in my back pocket so I can pull it out and go, see, it is internally consistent. More than that, though, I'd say the other major problem, aside from trying to predict everything, is communication. It is already hard in non-genre books written in the modern day to accurately describe the level of connectedness that we have as a society. When almost every character you ever write about has a cell phone in their pocket on which they can instantly call pretty much anyone else in the world, that's really hard to not be dumb with.
Yeah.
And this is a problem that I think all genres that deal with communications technology are constantly suffering from. And, going back to the X-Files again, which is where I think we first started to really use cell phones in our modern storytelling, they would use them incredibly haphazardly. Like how Superman sometimes forgets that he has heat vision in all the old Super Friends cartoons, and he'd get into a problem that would be super easy to solve if he just used his heat vision. But the writers were like, no, we forgot that he has heat vision for this one scene, so sorry. And that's kind of how cell phones were and continue to be. And then if you take that into 35 years in the future, where in the Blue Screen books, in the Mirador books, most of the people in the story have a computer actually inside their head called a genie. That's my little extrapolation of, the next step we're going to take after ubiquitous supercomputer cell phones that we already have is, they'll be actually integrated into our brains. Once you have those, communication becomes so easy and so instant that I had to really go out of my way to, first of all, find ways to include characters who are not in the scene. Because if one character is freaking out, one character just learned something, or she's terrified, or she's running away from somebody, or she is exploring some new place alone, of course she's not going to be alone. She can, with a single thought, communicate with anyone anywhere in the world. And so remembering to keep people connected was hard. And then even harder than that was finding plausible reasons, if I really needed a character to be alone, to explain why they were alone in this scene and why they weren't chatting or talking with somebody else. What really made this hit home for me, my office in my basement of my house is right next door to my oldest daughter's bedroom. And one day while I was down here writing, I heard her talking to two of her friends. And I thought, that's weird. I thought she only had one friend here. And I listened a little closely, and I couldn't really tell what they were saying through the wall, but I could definitely recognize three voices, and at one point realized, wait a minute, one of those voices has a German accent. And went and peeked my head in the door, and it was my daughter and her friend from down the street and her other friend who lives in Germany who was just on FaceTime or Skype or something. And the three of them were just hanging out as if distance had become meaningless and, you could be anywhere you wanted at any time. And that's, if we're already living in that world, then describing accurately the future of that world and figuring out how to tell stories with that kind of connectedness was a big obstacle that I am still working on portraying accurately.
Wow. I have another question to ask you about that, but before I do, I want to pause for just a second, Dan, and say that this show is sponsored by Audible.com, and for a recommendation this week that I would like to share with our listeners is one that I listened to not too long ago, and it's your book, The Devil's Only Friend, the John Cleaver book 4, narrated by Kirby Hayborn. Fantastic story. When you were on the show last, The Devil's Only Friend was just coming out, and I read it, and then was looking through the other day and listened to the sample of the audiobook, and absolutely loved it. Fantastic production, great story, and I would just like to recommend The Devil's Only Friend by Dan Wells for our Audible pick of the week.
Well, thank you.
Sure. But back to Blue Screen, real quick. I think what endears most of us to genre fiction is that in the midst of this really cool window dressing that we put on the story by setting it in different genres and different futuristic worlds or fantasy worlds or whatever, all of that becomes window dressing to really tell a human story in new and exciting ways, for us to expose the human condition, by using some of these tropes to allow us to get a new way to look at people and how they interact with each other. How difficult does that become when you're telling human stories and exposing the human condition, when you're dealing with a change in humanity, if you will, especially when you're talking about bioengineering and the way that communication completely changes the way we interact with each other?
Well, that's hard, isn't it? That's my brilliant answer to that. One of the things that the truisms of fiction is that no matter how much technology changes, I think people will always be the same. And we will get to the point, and in science fiction we often talk about, and in fantasy we often talk about settings and cultures and societies where the rules are so different that what is taboo has changed, or what is common has changed, or what is ridiculous or terrifying has changed. But the core nature of us as people, I think, will always be the same. And so if something is taboo in your culture, that one specific taboo could shift to be a dozen different things over a dozen different books. But the way that people react to cultural taboos will always be the same. There will be the kind of people who shun them, the kind of people who outlaw them, the kind of people who attack them, the kind of people who embrace them. And so trying to find, like you said, those human stories and that, I think, inescapable human nature at the core of those stories is what makes it work. One of the things that I tried to do with this series, it's young adult, like Partials was, but one of the tropes that I always dislike about young adult, and that I totally did in Partials, is that the characters are basically without parental supervision. We want to tell stories about teens, but we want them to have their freedom to go wherever and do whatever, because teens don't have a lot of freedom. Kids don't necessarily have the ability to go anywhere and do anywhere. And when we tell stories, it's an easy crutch to change that. And it is very hard, actually, in genre fiction to think of a middle grade or young adult story in which the characters are under the supervision of their parents. In fact, most people, certainly casual readers and even a lot of hardcore readers, if you ask them, it will take them a long time to name one in which the parents aren't straight up just dead. That's the joke about Roald Dahl, right? Is that he kills the parents in the first chapter, assuming they're not already dead before the book starts.
Or Walt Disney in the first scene.
Yeah, I mean, it's just kind of how we tell the stories. And so me being the contrarian that I am, with the Mirador books, I decided, well, our main character is going to have a family. And her name is Marisa Carneseca. She is Mexican-American, lives in Los Angeles in the year 2050. And she lives with her parents and with her siblings. She has 2 brothers and 2 sisters. One of the brothers is estranged. But she lives in one house with her mom and her dad and her 2 little sisters and her 1 little brother and her grandma, all together in the same house. And then on top of that, this being the future, the house itself has a limited artificial intelligence, in kind of the Internet of Things concept, that it knows when people are home and it knows what they're doing and where they're going and all of these things. And so the relationship that Marisa has with her family is a big part of the book. And like I said earlier, I've got a teenage daughter. My daughter's 14 now, and I wanted to show more of a father-daughter relationship, partly because that's not something I've ever written about. I've done with John Cleaver a lot of mother-son stuff, but I have never really written a father-daughter relationship. Kira in Partials doesn't have a father. So, I did that, and they have a very loving and a very antagonistic relationship. Because, as I started by explaining, I don't think that human nature changes very much. And I think when someone becomes a teenager, they're going to start clashing with their parents. And I actually think that's a very healthy thing to do, as much as it drives me bonkers in my own children. Because we need to establish who we are as individuals and who we are as people, and all of those kind of things that happen during adolescence and that, make adolescence so hard to live with and yet so wonderful and so, I think, full of energy and innovation, because they are constantly breaking away from their parents. And so Marisa and her father argue and they fight, but they still love each other a lot. And so basically just kind of shining a big light and magnifying for dramatic purposes the relationship I have with my daughter and putting that into this story. It's a crazy cyberpunk science fiction world with, everyone has a computer in their head and all this other weird stuff, but it has that core human story of here's a father and a daughter, here's a girl and her sister, and the ways that they get along and the ways that they don't get along, and the reasons that we do the things we do, the reasons that we go through all of that window dressing you're talking about and have the crazy adventures that we have in a science fiction thriller, all come back to the standard human reasons that anyone does anything. It's because I love my family. It's because I want to protect someone. It's because I want to get something, which, regardless of those trappings, we can all relate to that core stuff.
Blue Screen is the next book and series that you're writing that is YA, like you talked about with Partials. When you were first on the show, we were talking about the John Cleaver series and how when you first began writing, you tried to write fantasy and that sort of thing, and it just never seemed to click with you. And all of your friends and writers group comrades were telling you, why don't you just write horror? That's what that's what is really clicking with you. And out of that came the John Cleaver series. Well, now you're beginning your second YA series in kind of this dystopian future. Was that a hard switch for you, or it's just as you matured as a writer, did these other options open up to you? Kind of talk about your switch from writing horror to writing YA, kind of dystopian.
Well, it wasn't a difficult switch to make because, like you just described, I didn't start in horror. I have always been trying to write about whatever I find to be thrilling or interesting or exciting, and that changes. And sometimes I'm really excited about a horror story, and so I will write a John Cleaver book, and then I get excited about something else, and I'll write something else. I have 3 books coming out this year. Blue Screen, which is young adult science fiction, in February. Over Your Dead Body, which is the new John Cleaver book that comes out in May. And then in November, a standalone adult science fiction corporate satire about the beauty industry. And that comes out in November, called Extreme Makeover Apocalypse Edition. And those 3 books are completely different from each other. Just wildly, there's virtually no common ground between them.
I love it.
And that's what I love to do, is to try new things all the time. I never want to be stuck in one genre or with one character and just have to write the same thing over and over. And some authors do, and that's what they love. Brian McClellan, who's a fantastic fantasy author and writes the Powder Mage series, and that's pretty much all he writes. He puts out Powder Mage books, he writes Powder Mage novellas, he does Powder Mage everything, and they're great, and that's what he loves to do. And then, there are other authors who, like me, I think I would go crazy if I had to write about one thing or one person over and over forever.
So the John Cleaver series is continuing. That was going to be one of the questions I asked, and then you just said there's a new book coming up. Do you see John Cleaver continuing on his adventures
in perpetuity? No, I don't. I wrote 3 books and thought I was done, and then got another great idea, and so we're doing another trilogy. Devil's Only Friend is book 4, but it's also technically just book 1 of a second trilogy.
Cool.
And then book 2 of that trilogy, Over Your Dead Body, comes out this year. And then next year, the 6th one, the 3rd or 6th, however you're counting, will come out in 2017. And at that point, once again, I assume I am done. I do not at this point intend to ever write any more John Cleaver books. But that's also what I said 5 years ago. So,
right.
Who knows what's going to happen? But as it stands for now, there will be 6 books, and then we'll be finished.
You've got some pretty exciting news about John Cleaver film that you posted on Facebook the other day. Would you like to talk about that?
I would love to, because it is super cool. So I think we talked about this last time. There's a movie, and that was filmed this year. I mean, last year around this time. Sorry.
Yeah.
And we have John Cleaver's being played by Max Records, who was the kid from Where the Wild Things Are. Although starting in March, he will be known as the kid from I'm Not a Serial Killer. Yay!
That's all right.
And his mom is being played by Laura Fraser, who's fantastic. She was in Breaking Bad. She was in Knight's Tale. She was in a bunch of other things. And then the other big star is the neighbor across the street, Mr. Crowley, is being played by Christopher Lloyd. And we are super excited to have him.
So cool.
So we filmed this movie last year, and we've been working towards this forever, trying to raise money, trying to get a script written, all of this stuff. Finally started filming last year in March, and then spent months polishing up the special effects, polishing up the editing. They're actually still working on that. I talked to the director yesterday, Billy O'Brien, and said, when are you going to have a version that I can watch? And he said, the night we premiere it at the film festival. because they are going to use every second they can to make it as good as they possibly can. But we've been submitting to film festivals and have just been accepted actually a week or two ago, and then it just became public a day or two ago that we've been accepted or selected rather as an official feature in the South by Southwest Film Festival, which is in March in Austin, Texas. And we are very excited to be there. It's one of the biggest film festivals in the country, I think probably second to Sundance. And it is a very kind of quirky environment. They pride themselves on including more horror than most mainstream film festivals do. They kind of seek out quirky movies on purpose. We're a perfect fit for that festival, and we're very excited to be there. So we will be premiering the world premiere of the I Am Not a Serial Killer movie, which is already getting buzz. Rolling Stone magazine, as they were kind of reviewing the announced slate of South by Southwest movies, they called us out as one of the most anticipated new premieres. So we're very excited. So we're premiering there, and the business model that an independent movie has is basically go to a film festival and impress somebody with money. And so we are going to go and we're going to show our movie, and then the director and the producers and the PR people are going to spend the rest of the week at parties and in bars schmoozing studios and distributors and saying, didn't you love our movie? Don't you want to buy the rights and distribute it and put it in theaters? So people keep asking, when will we actually be able to see the movie? I don't know. I do know that it won't be soon. We are trying to get into some foreign festivals as well, like Cannes and Toronto and that kind of stuff. And we are more appealing to those festivals the less we have been shown publicly.
Yeah.
So this is the world premiere at South by Southwest. If we don't want to ruin our chances of getting into other festivals, which means we are not just going to run out and like rent a theater and show it to fans and stuff, because that makes us a little less appealing to a lot of other festivals if everyone's already seen the movie. They like to be, if not the world premiere, then at least like we're the European premiere, or we're the second time this movie's ever been shown, or something like that. So people who are not rich studio owners or film festival patrons are going to have to wait. Being honest, at least a year. I will be shocked and amazed if this movie is in theaters any earlier than summer of 2017, and even that is probably ambitious and a little unrealistic. So just temper your expectations. It will be a long time before you get to see it, but eventually you will, and it will be awesome.
Yes, it will. I think South by Southwest is an excellent place to debut it. That seems to be where kind of all the cool buzz comes out lately. So that's exciting. I'm excited for you.
Very exciting.
Yeah. About a year ago, my daughter Lauren, who turns 18 this weekend, came home. She's very close friends with the school librarian, and the librarian kind of slips her new stuff under the radar, and kind of like a drug dealer does with books. And she came home all excited one day, and she had this book that the librarian gave her before school, and she had kind of been reading on the sly in all of her classes that day. And it was about 150 pages into partials. And she came home all excited. She said, Dad, you've got to see this book by this guy, and it's awesome. And I've just completely been sucked into it. And I was like, oh, yeah, that's Dan Wells. He's one of the hosts of Writing Excuses that I listen to every Monday morning. And it kind of blew her mind, that I knew somebody that she thought she had just discovered, that I was like, yeah, Dan's, I have all of his John Cleaver books on my Kindle, and she thought that she had, discovered something that I had never heard of, and but but
And
writing
you ruined that for her.
That's right. I ruined it for her. So anyway, so I turned her on to Writing Excuses, and she listens every Monday, like me. But you guys have started in January. You began a new season of Writing Excuses. How many years is this now that you guys have been doing this?
This is season 11, which I think works out to around 7.5, 8 years. We put ourselves recently onto the model where every year is a season. We were not doing that at first, and so it doesn't map exactly 1-to-1.
Yeah, you guys are doing some new experimenting with a new format for the last couple of seasons. How's that working for you?
We are very happy with it. We decided what we wanted to do in 2015 was really sit down. This was the next step. It was 2 or 3 years ago that we said, well, let's just make each year a season and call it good. And so at the start of 2015, we said we want to provide some actual structure to this so that we can look at season 10 and say, season 10 is about X. And what we chose was kind of the basic process of writing a book from beginning to end. And so January was all about brainstorming and in February outlining. I don't remember exactly how it worked, but we followed through those steps all the way through in December, showing your work, giving your book to people to read, sending your book out to editors and agents and that kind of thing, and really over the course of the year take you through this structured process of actually writing a book beginning to end. What we are doing now in 2016, and honestly, this one has me even more excited, is what we're calling it elemental genres. And the best way to explain what we mean by that might be talking about the Alien movies, the Ridley Scott Alien movies. So the first one, I guess only the first one is Ridley Scott. They're all about aliens in space and humans being killed by them. But the first one was a horror story, and the second one was a military thriller, and the third one was a slasher movie, and within, there's that core concept and what you call the window dressing. We're going to tell this story and it has these elements to it. It has, the Weyland-Yutani Corporation, and it has the aliens that are parasitic and that take us over and that gestate inside of human bodies, all these different things. But then each of them has their own, I don't want to say subgenre, which is why we coined the term elemental genre. That, one of them is a horror story and one of them is a military and so on and so on. And so each month we're looking at different elemental genre. And we don't necessarily mean fantasy. We mean sense of wonder. If a book is designed to give you a sense of wonder, then that is a what we're calling an elemental genre. If a book is designed to make you laugh, if a book is designed to explore a relationship between two characters, if a story is designed to scare you or to thrill you or to be a mystery that you have to solve, these are the elemental genres that really can be applied to any setting or what we think of as a classical genre: science fiction, fantasy, mystery, all these things. So yeah, that's what we're doing this year, and I think it's going to be really cool.
I'm enjoying it so far. I can't wait to see how the season goes. It's really cool. Glad to see that you guys are still innovating after putting out so much great content over the years. Dan, thank you so much for coming on the show today to revisit and to talk about your new stuff. Where can people find you and connect with you and get plugged in with all your work?
Well, the easy thing to remember with me is to put an in front of my name. So, The Dan Wells is everywhere. If you look up Dan Wells online, you're more likely than not you're going to find a very web-savvy Hollywood actor who got everything first. And so I am the Dan Wells. So my website is thedanwells.com. My Twitter handle is @thedanwells. On Facebook, on everything, that's how you can find me. So look me up, and I've got a lot of, I recently was able to put not all of, but most of my short fiction that's been available in various other anthologies and things. Those are all available now electronically on my website, including Next of Kin, which is the John Cleaver short. So I'm excited to have all of those things now in one place for people to find.
Yeah. So cool. Thanks, Dan, for coming on the show. And Blue Screen comes out February 16th. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Excellent. We'll put links to everything in the show notes. Thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you very much.